The courthouse steps. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final punctuation mark on the last 8 years of my life. My name is Fiona Calloway. I am 35 years old, and exactly 3 minutes ago, my divorce was finalized. I stood on the cold stone steps, the fatting afternoon wind whipping through my hair, clutching a thick manila envelope against my chest. Inside was the final decree, the judge's signature barely dry on the parchment. My hands were shaking so violently that I almost dropped my phone twice as I desperately scrolled through my contacts. My thumb hovered over one name: Dad. When the call finally connected and I heard his voice, I didn't even say hello. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a deep breath, and spoke with a cold, unwavering clarity that surprised even myself. Dad, it's done. The ink is dry. Now I need you to do exactly what we planned. Fire them. Fire every single one of them. All 27 employees my in-laws planted in our company. Security needs to escort them out of the building before the clock strikes 5. To understand why a newly divorced woman's first instinct on the courthouse steps was to trigger a corporate mass execution, you have to understand the legacy of Calloway steel fabrication. My father, Harold Calloway, built this empire from nothing. In 1987, he was just a man with a dream, operating out of a single, drafty rented warehouse with a handful of mismatched tools. Through sheer grit, sweat, and bloody knuckles, he transformed that tiny operation into one of the largest structural steel suppliers in the entire region. On my 30th birthday, he handed me a beautifully framed certificate representing 25% ownership of the company. I remember his eyes welling up with pride as he looked at me and said, "Fiona, this isn't just a business. It's a legacy. It is yours to grow, and more importantly, it is yours to protect." And then came Reginald Voss. The VOSS invasion. I married Reginald 8 years ago, believing he was the gentle, supportive partner I had always wanted. But looking back, the warning signs were there from our very first family dinner. Reginald's mother, Delphine Voss, was a woman wrapped in silk and venom. She possessed a terrifying ability to mask pure greed under the guise of sweet, maternal concern. During that first dinner, as she looked around our home, she made it clear that she did not view my father's multi-million-dollar company as something earned through decades of hard work. To Delphine, Calloway Steel was a buffet, an untapped corporate resource waiting to be systematically redirected into the pockets of her own bloodline. She never had the courage to say it outright, of course. Delphine was far too calculating for that. Instead, she would lean in during family gatherings, pat my hand condescendingly, and sigh, "Oh, Fiona darling, family should always look out for family." Reginald's cousins are just so incredibly talented, and it breaks my heart to see them wasting away in minor jobs. It would be an absolute shame for Calloway Steel not to utilize such brilliant minds. I was young, madly in love, and desperately wanted to please my new family. Slowly, deliberately, the poison seeped in. One by one, over the course of 6 years, Voss relatives and Delphine's hand-picked associates began filling crucial positions across our corporate structure. They infiltrated payroll, dominated logistics, seized control of procurement, and ironically, even wormed their way into our internal audit department. My father, trusting my judgment completely, and genuinely believing that my marriage meant our two families had merged into one unstoppable unit, approved every single hire I recommended. He never once questioned why an influx of new managers all shared the exact same surname as his son-in-law. It took me 6 long years to realize I wasn't just helping my husband's family. I was actively financing the corporate parasite that was eating my father's legacy from the inside out. The fragile paper trail. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. It started with minor discrepancies that the audit department, run by Reginald's second cousin, conveniently dismissed as rounding errors. A missing shipment invoice here. A strange discrepancy in raw material costs there. Then, I noticed a lucrative vendor contract for safety equipment had quietly changed hands, moving away from our partner of 10 years to a newly registered LLC. When I dug through the state registry, I found the LLC belonged to a shell company registered under Delphine Voss's maiden name. The fraud quickly escalated from a trickle to a roaring flood. Massive steel orders, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that should have required 3 separate layers of executive approval, were sailing through the system with a single digital signature from Reginald's cousin, Desmond, whom Delphine had pushed into the head of the procurement department. In the logistics sector, a manager named Preston, another one of Delphine's loyal nephews, was systematically rerouting premium structural beams to a secondary warehouse. On paper, this warehouse didn't officially exist anywhere within the Callaway corporate structure. I remember the night I finally built up the courage to confront Reginald. We were sitting at our elegant mahogany dining table, and my chest felt tight with anxiety. I laid out a few printed spreadsheets gently between our plates. "Reggie," I said softly, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Some of these numbers in procurement and logistics aren't adding up. Desmond and Preston are signing off on things that look questionable. I think we need an independent review." Reginald didn't even look at the papers. He let out a loud, mocking laugh, taking a slow sip of his wine. "Fiona, sweetheart, you are being completely paranoid. You're seeing massive conspiracies where there is literally just family helping family run things efficiently. Relax." But I couldn't relax. Months later, when the anomalies grew too large to ignore, I raised the issue again, my tone sharper this time. Reginald's demeanor instantly shifted. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a cold, calculated distance that chilled me to the bone. "You sound incredibly ungrateful, Fiona," he whispered, his voice dripping with anger. "After everything my mother has done to help our business thrive, after all the loyal people she provided when your father was struggling to find staff, you sit here and accuse them of theft. Don't ever bring this up again." The secret investigation. That was the exact moment I realized my husband wasn't a victim of his mother's manipulation. He was an active participant. Knowing I could trust absolutely no one within the company walls, I took matters into my own hands. I privately hired a high-end forensic accountant, paying her entirely in cash drawn from a personal account my father had set up for me decades ago. For 11 grueling months, my life became a spy novel. We never met near the office or our home. Instead, I drove 40 minutes away, twice a week, to a dimly lit coffee shop in a neighboring town where no one would recognize us. What she uncovered across those 11 months took my breath away. It was an intricate, deeply embedded web of corruption. 27 distinct employees, every single one of them connected through blood, marriage, or deep financial ties to Delphine Voss, were strategically placed across every critical money-handling department of Callaway Steel. Together, this corporate cartel had successfully siphoned off nearly $4 million over a 6-year period. They did it through brilliantly inflated invoices, charging the company for premium services that were never rendered. They authorized massive, phantom consulting fees to non-existent experts. Most egregiously, Preston's logistics company was billing us heavily for warehouse space that, when my investigator physically checked the coordinates, turned out to be nothing more than an overgrown, gravel-filled empty lot behind a decaying strip mall that Delphine Voss legally owned. I felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over me, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. And most importantly, I did not confront Reginald. I knew that if I showed my hand too early, Delphine's high-priced lawyers would find a way to tie the company up in litigation, freeze our assets, or destroy the digital evidence before we could secure the servers. Instead, I quietly walked into a prominent divorce attorney's office and filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. I agreed to a modest separation agreement, moved into a small, drafty rental house, and kept that devastating forensic accounting report sealed in a locked drawer waiting. Some people might look at my silence during those months and call it cowardly. I call it patient. I call it tactical. Because the moment I was legally, completely free of Reginald Voss, the very second no marital tie could be used to legally protect his parasitic family, I knew I could strike without an ounce of guilt or hesitation holding my back. The Great Purge. And that brings us back to the courthouse steps. Standing there in my sharp gray blazer, the one I had chosen specifically because it made me feel like the powerful corporate executive I was always meant to be, I laid bare the ugly truth to my father. For 4 intense, breathless minutes, I condensed 6 years of agony into a stream of cold facts. I told him about the empty gravel lot, the millions in phantom fees, the systematic draining of his life's work. There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear my father's heavy, ragged breathing. Finally, he spoke, his voice cracking with an old man's heartbreak and a founder's sudden rage. "Send me the report, Fiona." Within 20 minutes of receiving the encrypted PDF, our head of HR, Linda, who had long suspected something was wrong but lacked the authority to act, was handed a definitive list of 27 names. Within 2 hours, the corporate purge began. It was a military-style operation. Security guards stood over Desmond, Preston, and 25 others as they were forced to pack their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, their access badges confiscated, their corporate accounts instantly locked down. By 4:45 p.m., the Voss empire within Callaway Steel had been completely dismantled. The confrontation, at the door. I expected a fallout, but I didn't expect it to arrive so soon. That very evening, while I was still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes in the living room of my small rental house, a violent pounding rattled my front door. It was so loud, so aggressive, that my neighbor's automatic porch light immediately flicked on across the driveway. I pulled open the door, and there stood Delphine Voss. In 8 years of forced pleasantries, awkward holiday dinners, and tense family brunches, I had never once heard this woman raise her voice above a polite, aristocratic murmur. But tonight, the mask of the elegant matriarch was completely gone. Her expensive hair was disheveled, her face was warped into a mask of pure scarlet fury, and her voice cracked with a terrifying, unhinged rage. She didn't even wait for me to speak. "You miserable, ungrateful little bitch," she shrieked, stepping directly into my doorway, her finger practically shoved into my face. "You will call your pathetic father right now and reverse every single one of those terminations. Do you hear me? You will reinstate my family immediately, or I promise you, in front of Almighty God and every single person on this street, you will spend the rest of your miserable life regretting you were ever born into a family that dared to touch what belongs to me." I stood firmly in my doorway, bathed in the fatting evening light, watching this terrifying woman shake with a venomous rage that I had spent nearly a decade carefully walking on eggshells to avoid. And for the first time in 8 years, looking at her, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, beautiful calm. "You need to step off my property, Delphine," I said, my voice incredibly steady, echoing clearly in the quiet neighborhood. Delphine let out a sharp, bitter, hysterical laugh. "Property? You think this cheap little rental is property? You have absolutely no idea what you've just done, Fiona. My family built half of what your incompetent father calls his company. Those 27 people have children, they have mortgages, they have families depending on those paychecks. Families that you are now starving out of pure, pathetic, childish spite because your marriage failed." I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression completely unreadable. "The only thing anyone has been starving, Delphine, is my father's business. Your family has been slowly, deliberately bleeding us dry for 6 years. And the independent forensic accounting report currently sitting securely in my lawyer's vault proves every single dollar of it." The word forensic hit her like a physical blow. Her face changed instantly. Just for a fraction of a second, a flicker of absolute panic flashed beneath her manic fury. The roaring fire in her eyes suddenly died down into embers of realization. She knew, in that exact moment, that I wasn't some scared little girl bluffing to get back at an ex-husband. I had the receipts. Sensing that her threats had completely failed, Delphine's demeanor underwent a sickening transformation. In under 30 seconds, she pivoted from a screaming monster to a tragic, weeping mother, her voice softening into a disgusting, false tenderness. "Fiona, please, darling," she pleaded, reaching out to touch my arm. Though I instantly stepped back out of her reach. "Reginald still loves you. He is absolutely devastated by this divorce. This can all be undone, sweet girl. We can fix this. If you just reconsider the divorce, reinstate the children at the company, we can let bygones be bygones. For the sake of the family, please." I almost admired the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it, the breathtaking speed at which she could swap her venom for honey. "There is no version of a reconsideration available to you, Delphine," I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "The divorce is final. The terminations are absolute. And if you, Desmond, Preston, or any of your other 24 thieves want to legally contest the loss of your positions, you are more than welcome to file a wrongful termination lawsuit. We will gladly see you in open court, where that forensic report will immediately become a matter of permanent public record for the world to see." That was the exact moment the false tears stopped. She realized she was completely trapped. She spat out one last, pathetic threat about her powerful connections and lawsuits, but I didn't care to listen. I simply closed the door in her face, locking it with a satisfying click. The reborn legacy. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Not because I ever regretted what I did, but because completely ripping out 6 years of deeply embedded corporate corruption meant we had to rebuild entire departments almost from scratch. The procurement files were an absolute disaster, and our logistics tracking software had been intentionally corrupted to hide the phantom warehouse shipments. To steady the ship, my father brought in a brilliant, sharp-eyed veteran operations manager named Thaddeus Cray. Thaddeus took immediate control of procurement and logistics, working 16-hour days alongside me to vet every single new hire based strictly on skill, integrity, and merit. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Within a single month, shipping delays that had plagued our clients for years, delays we were always told were unavoidable supply chain issues, mysteriously vanished entirely. Our vendor costs, once artificially inflated by Desmond's fraudulent schemes, dropped by a staggering 18% almost overnight. Once the fraudulent shell company contracts were legally terminated and replaced with legitimate, competitively bid agreements, the company's profit margins skyrocketed. My father called me every single evening during that first month. Sometimes he didn't even have a specific reason to call. He just wanted to read me the updated daily earnings and operational numbers. With every phone call, I could hear his voice growing lighter, more vibrant, more alive. He sounded like a man who was slowly realizing that a crushing, invisible weight he had carried for so long that he'd forgotten it was there had finally been lifted off his shoulders. Reginald called me exactly once, 3 weeks after the explosive confrontation with his mother. I sat in my office, watching his name flash on the screen before finally picking up. His voice was incredibly quiet, stripped of the arrogant laughter and defensiveness he had used throughout our marriage. He didn't try to defend Delphine. He didn't say a single word in defense of the 27 names on that list. "Fiona," he said softly, clearing his throat, I just wanted to ask how you were doing." For a brief, fleeting moment, the version of the man I had genuinely fallen in love with 8 years ago peeked through the cracks of the monstrous entity his mother had spent a decade constructing. "I am doing better than I have in years, Reginald," I replied honestly. "I really am." There was a long pause. "I'm glad," he whispered. He hung up and he never called again. The multi-million-dollar lawsuits Delphine had loudly promised never materialized. Her high-priced corporate lawyer, once he actually sat down in a conference room and reviewed the mountain of undeniable evidence my legal team shared during the initial discovery phase, quietly pulled his client aside. He bluntly advised her that pursuing litigation against Callaway Steel would only result in an immediate criminal referral to the federal authorities for grand larceny and corporate fraud. The threats stopped as suddenly as they had started. Desmond and Preston packed their bags and quietly fled the state within 2 months, desperately trying to put distance between themselves and the crime scene. The shell logistics company that Delphine had used to bill us for that empty gravel lot was legally dissolved before the year's end, a frantic attempt to bury the paper trail before the IRS or the authorities came looking too closely. My father ultimately chose not to press formal criminal charges. It wasn't because he lacked the evidence. We had enough to put them away for a long time. But he sat me down in his office one afternoon, poured us 2 glasses of whiskey, and said plainly, "Fiona, watching that arrogant family lose everything they tried to build on stolen ground. Watching them live with the terrifying knowledge of what we hold against them is punishment enough for me. Pursuing a public criminal trial will only drag our family name through years of ugly, sensationalized headlines. We are better than that. Our future is brighter than their garbage. I understood his wisdom, even if a small, vengeful part of me wanted to see them in handcuffs. 6 months later, Callaway Steel Fabrication posted the highest, most profitable quarterly earnings in its 40-year history. The company was finally, entirely staffed by incredibly talented, hardworking people who had earned their desks through absolute merit rather than a toxic bloodline. That spring, my father organized a massive company-wide meeting. We stood out on the roaring, metallic warehouse floor, surrounded by the smell of iron and the sparks of welding torches, the exact same floor where he had started the company in 1987 with nothing but a dream. In front of every single employee gathered, Harold Callaway stepped up to the microphone, his eyes shining with tears, and officially named me the president and chief executive officer of Callaway Steel. He took my hand, looked out at the cheering crowd, and said, "This company has finally been returned to the people who actually built it, and it is in the safest hands it will ever know." I stood there, looking out at the sea of clapping hands, wearing the exact same gray blazer from the courthouse steps. And for the very first time in my entire life, I looked around and realized that the company, my legacy, and my life finally, truly belonged to me.